The date is August 15th, 1971. U.S. President Richard Nixon gets on national television and announces a decision that will fundamentally change money forever.
The strength of a nation's currency is based on the strength of that nation's economy. And the American economy is by far the strongest in the world. Accordingly, I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States. Now, what is this action, which is very technical, what does it mean for you? Let me lay to rest the bugaboo of what is called devaluation. If you want to buy a foreign car or take a trip abroad, market conditions may cause your dollar to buy slightly less. But if you are among the overwhelming majority of Americans who buy American-made products in America, your dollar will be worth just as much tomorrow as it is today. The effect of this action, in other words, will be to stabilize the dollar.
On the date of recording this video, it's been exactly 55 years since this address. The two main points that he makes here are that this is going to strengthen the dollar and that it's going to be a temporary decision. But in this video, I want to explore what if it actually had been temporary? What if the dollar had remained on the gold standard? What would be the economic impact today if we had kept this convertibility? But before we can figure out what would have happened if America did stay on the gold standard, we need to understand the circumstances of the time and what led to this decision in the first place. To understand this, we have to go back to the end of World War II. In 1944, representatives from 44 countries met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design a new international monetary system. Under this new system, other major currencies were tied to the US dollar, while the dollar itself could be converted into gold at a fixed price of $35 per ounce. That made the dollar the centerpiece of the global monetary system. And initially, it did work. The United States emerged from World War II holding an enormous share of the world's monetary gold, while Europe and Japan desperately needed dollars to rebuild. But the system contained a contradiction. For the world's economy to grow, the rest of the world needed more dollars. But every dollar the United States supplied abroad was another potential claim against America's finite gold reserves. Eventually, there were more claims on gold than gold itself. By 1960, total outstanding dollar liabilities exceeded the U.S. gold stock. And by 1965, even the dollar claims held by foreign institutions with the ability to redeem them exceeded the gold available to back them. Economist Robert Triffin had warned about this problem exactly. The world needed dollars, but creating the dollars that the world needed made the promise to convert those dollars into gold increasingly difficult to maintain. And by the summer of 1971, that contradiction was slowly becoming a crisis. So this part of the story is where the speculators that Nixon mentioned in his address come into play. Investors, businesses, and other market participants could see the same problem. If the US couldn't maintain the dollar's value under the existing system, eventually something had to give. So money began to move out of dollars into currencies like the German mark and the Japanese yen, which investors expected to rise relative to the dollar. Under the Bretton Woods system, foreign central banks had to absorb many of the dollars to prevent their own currencies from rising beyond the agreed upon exchange rates. And those dollars accumulating represented even more potential claims on America's remaining gold supply. When Nixon said that speculators were waging an all-out war on the American dollar, he was talking about a very real flight away from the dollar as a reserve currency. But calling it an attack leaves out an important question. Were these speculators creating the crisis, or were they simply reacting to a crisis that already existed? And that brings us to another very interesting point of Nixon's speech, which was what he called the bugaboo of devaluation, which, if you're watching this video, you probably think is the most interesting point as well. Devaluation sounds a bit complicated, but under the Bretton Woods system, this idea was pretty simple. The United States had outright promised that gold was worth $35 per ounce. So in effect, the dollar had a fixed value in terms of gold. But by 1971, the markets were increasingly starting to signal that this fixed price didn't make sense anymore. If the US officially raised the price of gold from, say, $35 to $42 an ounce, each dollar would effectively represent less actual gold. So that would be devaluation. And because other currencies were tied to the dollar, changing the dollar's gold value would ripple through the entire international monetary system.
Let me lay to rest the bugaboo of what is called devaluation. If you are among the overwhelming majority of Americans who buy American-made products in America, your dollar will be worth just as much tomorrow as it is today.
And in the short term, Nixon's promise wasn't necessarily wrong. Americans didn't wake up the next morning to find out that their dollars suddenly bought half as much at the grocery store. But something fundamental had changed. The dollar was no longer redeemable for a fixed quantity of gold by foreign official holders. And despite Nixon calling this suspension temporary, this convertibility never returned. Just 4 months later, the US and other major economies reached what became known as the Smithsonian Agreement. The price of gold was raised from $35 to $38 an ounce, effectively devaluing the dollar. But even that wasn't enough to save the system. In 1973, the dollar devalued once again, and the world's major currencies moved toward floating exchange rates. The Bretton Woods era was officially over. For the first time in modern American history, the dollar no longer represented a claim on a monetary asset with a naturally limited supply. So what actually happens next? Well, we have 55 years of data to look at, and the simplest place to start is with Nixon's own promise that your dollar will be worth just as much tomorrow as it is today. Well, tomorrow, sure, that was true, but according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, since August of 1971, the US dollar has lost approximately 88% of its purchasing power. Now, this doesn't mean that leaving the gold standard caused every bit of inflation that we've experienced since then, and it certainly doesn't mean that every economic problem since can be traced back to one decision, but it does tell us something important about the monetary system that replaced it and that we find ourselves in today. The dollar was no longer constrained by convertibility into a scarce monetary asset. So now getting to the question that I'm proposing in this video, what if Nixon hadn't made that decision to leave the gold standard? Well, the honest answer is that America probably would have had to accept some economic pain in the short term. The system that existed up until 1971 wasn't sustainable in its current form. Keeping gold convertibility likely would have meant tighter monetary policy, higher interest rates, less government spending, a higher official price of gold, or some combination of all of those. That could have meant a recession, it could have meant higher unemployment, and politically, those decisions aren't easy to make. But that's the trade-off that you choose. Instead, we chose flexibility. The government and the Federal Reserve gained much more freedom to respond to recessions, financial crises, wars, and eventually things like a global pandemic. And maybe, based on that, you think that the decision was worth it. But that flexibility also changed fundamentally what it means to save a dollar. Like we said, over the last 55 years, the dollar lost roughly 88% of its purchasing power, And if you want to buy an ounce of gold today, it'll cost you around 4,600 US dollars when you compare that to $35 under the Bretton Woods agreement. So today, saving for the long term means you can't really just save your money. You have to own something: stocks, real estate, gold, businesses, something that's expected to appreciate faster than the currency loses its purchasing power. And I think that's the most important consequence of the system that we chose. Gold was the answer to this problem for thousands of years, but gold also has its limitations. It's difficult to move, it's difficult to custody at scale, and its supply can increase when there's more economic incentive to mine it. Bitcoin asks a pretty interesting question. What if we could have the scarcity of gold without actually having to implement a gold standard of money? What if there was a monetary asset with a fixed supply that can be transferred globally, held directly, and doesn't require a government to promise that your dollars are redeemable for it? Maybe the lesson from 1971 isn't that the dollar needs to return to a gold standard. Maybe it's that the thing that gold was trying to accomplish still matters today.